We live in an age of tragedy that is rooted in the near-total denial of the scientific discoveries of Johannes Kepler in the early 1600s. If Kepler's discoveries were acknowledged today, we would live in a virtual paradise, without war, poverty, hunger, economic collapse, and without an energy crisis, because these would have been all put aside for meeting the great challenge that the return of the Ice Age has placed before us all, which the denial of Kepler has hidden from us. If this challenge had been met and been responded to, it would have caused humanity to create the greatest renaissance of all times. This would have been the natural response for the imperatives of the future. It still is that today. It remains as an unresolved challenge. If the challenge had been met, it would have put an end to the rule of empire that prohibits human development on every front. For this reason, the masters of empire have quietly decapitated all three of the vital support structures that civilization depends on: our system of politics, economics, and science. Politics have become fascist, laced with war. Economics have become monetarist, laced with looting and destruction. The most tragic decapitation, however, is imposed on science, to the point that 99.999% of the mass of the universe and its power is deemed not to exist. If Kepler had been heeded in modern times, it would be recognized that the most essential part of the universe that is now being denied to exist does indeed exist, whereby the denial of it reveals itself as being one of the vital key elements standing behind the tragedies of the modern world. The fundamental technical aspects of the denial of Kepler has been already presented in part 1 of the series Kepler Today, named Science Revolution. The video presented here is more focused on what results from the denial. An exploration of the method and the consequences is critical because it has deep-reaching implications on nearly the entire horizon of civilization. On the intentionally created platform of waging war against humanity on all fronts, as we see it reflected in the decapitation of politics, economics, and science, where the war is fought with all the pomp and power of empire. The greatest tragedy is that this war against humanity is widely supported in society, rather than society defending itself against it. By this deep failing, humanity's very existence is now threatened, like by a disease that has festered and become acute. Because the most severe consequences for humanity result from the decapitation of science, the video exploration is primarily focused on that. However, because the entire process of decapitation has been craftily hidden, it is also necessary to briefly explore the process that is being used for decapitating politics and economics, where the process is less concealed and is actually boasted about. An example may be found in the tragedy of the Titanic. The Titanic was the most modern ocean liner ever built up to its time. It was the pride of the shipbuilding industry and a marvel of engineering and construction capability. Note the man standing at the bottom right. The ship was gigantic and was designed with so much built-in redundancy and buoyancy that it was, for all practical considerations, unsinkable. The world was shocked, therefore, when this marvel of ingenuity sank on its maiden voyage. Humanity had been riding high on a great crest of cultural optimism that came with the rise of an industrial revolution that promised to have no limit. It seemed unbelievable against this background when the news circulated to the world in 1912 that the impossible had happened, that the Titanic had sank, that it was history, that it lay broken on the bottom of the sea. But was it really an accident like it is being remembered? The pages of history tell us that shortly before midnight on the 14th of April 1912, 4 days into its maiden voyage, the much-heralded, unsinkable ship had struck an iceberg that had injured the ship so severely that it could no longer remain afloat. We are told that the Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15, 1912, 2 hours and 40 minutes after its collision with the iceberg. The sinking resulted in the deaths of 1,517 people of the 2,223 people on board. This makes it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history outside of war. The high casualty rate was due in part to the fact that although complying with maritime regulations of the time, the ship did not carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. We are told that the ship had a lifeboat capacity for only 1,178 people, while its onboard capacity was 3,547. However, it is generally admitted that the ship was constructed to carry 64 lifeboats, 4 for each of its 16 davits, for a total capacity of 4,000. It is being omitted that the operator of the ship had decided to carry only 16 lifeboats, plus 4 collapsible boats with canvas sides, instead of the 64 it was designed to carry. The lacking lifeboat was therefore by choice, not by design. Also, a disproportionate number of the men aboard the Titanic went down with the ship, as women and children were given priority. Some people are now suggesting that this too was arranged for a specific reason. Among the many men who went to their icy grave with the Titanic were three of the wealthiest men of America, patriots of the entrepreneurial class of the New Age. They were men who might have prevented the making of the far greater tragedy for the world that followed the sinking of the Titanic, had they lived to do so. It has been suggested in later years, long after the sinking of the Titanic had happened, that the sinking of it had been arranged in order to eliminate these three critical men from the political horizon who seemed committed to prevent the foreign takeover of America's economic lifeblood, its currency, by the London-centered banking empire that was being set up to happen at this time. One of the three men that went down with the ship was John Astor, the famous hotel developer of the Astoria chain and captain of many industries. He was the wealthiest man in the world at the time. The second man was the famous Benjamin Guggenheim, one of the greatest American industrialists. The third was Isidor Straus, the owner of Macy's department stores. These men were patriotic Americans with great personal resources who, as it is being said, would have blocked the sellout of America and the plans for war that were already in the making that America had been planned to be drawn into. The masters of empire evidently knew who in America had the means, the influence, and the commitment to stand in the way of their taking over the country. Thus the masters developed a solution to clear the slate. It is interesting to note that J.P. Morgan, who had contracted the building of the Titanic, had been scheduled to be on the maiden voyage, but had cancelled. Some people point to the timing and suggest that the great Titanic was sunk for an incomparably greater imperative, the gaining control of the economic lifeblood of America. The stakes in that game were enormously huge. The three men who could have blocked this had to die, though without a backlash being unleashed by it. The project required an act so unbelievable that no link would ever be inferred. Indeed, how else would the masters of empire be able to kill three of the biggest names in the American capitalist world, who were known to be opposed to their plan, and to accomplish this without raising any eyebrows? Who in this case would tie the sinking of a brand new ship, and an unsinkable ship at that, to an assassination plot against just three of its passengers? That's insane, right? That's unbelievable, isn't it? This is probably why it was done. The ship itself was a pittance as an asset in the overall scheme. It was no doubt fully insured, or even over-insured. It probably wasn't a huge feat either to invite the three targeted men separately onto the maiden voyage of the greatest ocean liner ever built, which the Titanic was at the time, especially considering that it was declared to be unsinkable, promising a safe journey where nothing could go wrong. Also, it probably wasn't difficult either for an experienced mariner to ram the ship into an iceberg at full speed in the middle of a moonless night so that it would sink, and to assure in the hubbub that the targeted victims would not get anywhere near to the few lifeboats that the ship carried, much less into them. It is being suggested that the captain must have been a party to the plot. The captain was a seasoned mariner. He knew the sea well. He had sailed those waters for 26 years. He was no fool. But he was also a Jesuit, a soldier of God, and as a soldier he would die if this was deemed necessary by God. He might have been seeing himself as a warrior serving in the war of his God against the Protestant abomination, that he might have been told that the ship was, as the Titanic had been built in a Protestant city, by Protestant workers. The captain might have been inspired to carry out a mission that had been commanded by God himself. It is known that the captain received his priest's personal blessing on the eve before the departure. The Jesuits would have been compliant with the planned project to sink the ship in order to oblige the financial masters of empire who were holding the key to the wells of the church. The captain might have been inspired to see the task before him as a critical one, arranged for him alone, from the highest level, from God, whom no one can refuse. That is probably the reason why the project unfolded with such flawless professional precision as it did. Evidently, the captain knew what he was doing when he drove the fastest ship afloat at full speed in a moonless light into an ice-infested stretch of sea, almost blindfolded. Only a fool would commit such a reckless, insane act, or a dedicated soldier on a mission. The captain had hands-on experience at the helm of great ships for close to 4 decades by then. He understood the dangers that icebergs pose and knew well where to expect them. Except this time he didn't fear the danger, he went for it. It was success that, in later years, in retrospect, by drawing all the threads together, that nothing else makes any sense. It appears that the game was planned with such an airtight precision that a hint had to be inserted into the plan that would unmistakably demonstrate to anyone who would see through the facade of the plot and be tempted to stand in the way of empire in the future, that resistance is futile. For this, the sinking of the Titanic was timed to occur on the anniversary day of the assassination of President Lincoln, almost to the hour. The Titanic and President Lincoln were both mortally wounded shortly before midnight on April the 14th, and both died the next morning. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was one of the last major events of the American Civil War. The war had ended on April the 9th, 1865, when the Confederate forces, the forces of empire, had been defeated on the battlefield, by which the war was shifted to a higher level. Lincoln, who had resisted the goals of empire, was assassinated 5 days after the American victory was won, as if to say, even then, resistance is futile. The goal that the American Civil War had been intended for was reached in the year following the sinking of the Titanic. The Federal Reserve Act became law. It was designed to achieve the same goal for the masters of empire that the Civil War had been launched for. The Federal Reserve Act that gave control of the nation's money into the hands of empire was rammed through on December the 23rd, 1913. It appears that the bill was rushed through the system in order that the congressmen and senators wouldn't be held back any longer from getting home for Christmas. These kinds of pressure tactics are not uncommon in modern times. Evidently, the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, stood in full support of the Empire's bill that had originally been concocted in private meetings in one of the mansions owned by the agents of empire. Those who suspect that the timing of the sinking of the Titanic tells a significant story are probably more aware of the mode of operation of the masters of empire than most people are. This general lack of awareness is probably the reasons why these kinds of games against the common aims of mankind and for the welfare of an imperial financial oligarchy are still being run as vigorously as ever, in which the traitors are being hailed. When President McKinley was murdered in 1901, the plot to sink the nation was already unfolding. The Republican Party boss Thomas Collier Platt had forced Theodore Roosevelt, a loyal empire man, onto McKinley as a running mate in the 1900 election. This was done against the wishes of McKinley's manager, Senator Mark Hanna. Theodore Roosevelt served as vice president from March to September, when McKinley was killed by a hired assassin. With the president murdered, Theodore Roosevelt became the president as planned. If the timing of these events tell us a significant story, then the enacting of the Federal Reserve System into law that handed the welfare of the nation into the hands of private banks makes the 3 assassinations on the Titanic and the collateral deaths of 1,514 people a relatively minor affair in comparison as the masters would have seen it. As the 3 men who died with the Titanic might have sensed, the eyes of the masters of empire had been on America as a whole as the long-standing enemy of empire since the nation had claimed its freedom from it. The assassination of McKinley in 1901 paved the way to the gradual sinking of America. So it was that as soon as the ink was dry on the Federal Reserve Act, the act was followed up with the Income Tax Act that provided the means to pay for the Federal Reserve's profits. And as one might expect, it was Woodrow Wilson who signed the act into law, who was later also the man who brought the USA into World War I in defense of empire, nicely arranged on the basis of lies and deceptions. Emboldened by their victory in America, the masters of empire prepared the stage for World War I to begin, that exploded in the very next year after the Federal Reserve Act had become law. A decade and a half down the road, the USA lay bankrupted on its knees, entering the worst depression in its history. A kind of economic ice age began, as it were. Today, the Federal Reserve Act still operates, and the depression it has enabled cuts now deeper than ever. 2 world wars have passed, and a Cold War that still lingers on to some degree, and still the Titanic as the process sails on. So it was that the old song of the Titanic, "Resistance is futile," continues to be the tune to the present day, while the trail of the corpses of the assassinated victims keeps on getting longer. The Titanic song, "Resistance is Futile," was interrupted only once. This occurred during the years of President Franklin Roosevelt. It became a brief holiday-type interlude that remains largely but a distant memory. Does anyone even remember FDR's face and his policies? Few do. On the day that FDR was laid in the grave, America's economic ice age was renewed. Even FDR's Glass-Steagall legislation that had prohibited the banks from looting America in order that America could live again, by which it became the greatest power in the world, has been repealed. Franklin Roosevelt's face has been forgotten. His policies have been trashed. The old imperial ice age world has been brought back. America has allowed everything to be trashed that it had built during its holiday in the sun. Of course, this was so by design, but it doesn't end there. The real Titanic struggle by empire had a far wider focus than merely bringing America to its knees. The wider focus had been to destroy the Titan that the empire fears the most, which is humanity itself. The naming of the ship that played a brief role in the long war of empire against humanity might have been chosen so as to hint at the ultimate objective of empire, which is to defeat humanity as a whole, the Titan, by any means with which this can be accomplished, always proclaiming along the way, resistance is futile, while in reality such resistance would be liberating, assuring freedom from the devastating impact of the empire of oligarchy. Until humanity's freedom from empire is won, the Titanic continues. The most critical phase has just begun. The long-expected astrophysical ice age lies ahead in uncharted waters. The modern Titanic flies into it, recklessly, by intention. The ice age ahead stands as a barrier that empire cannot pass. And so, for as long as humanity remains latched to the system of empire and flies with its imperatives, it will collapse with the reality of the coming ice age that has already started, and it will go down to its grave with the ship. To date, no lifeboats have been provided to secure humanity and civilization. Not a single one. In 1912, the Titanic was infinitely better equipped than we are today. While in 1912, the Titanic hadn't been provisioned with the 64 lifeboats the ship had been designed to carry, which would have been amply sufficient to secure the life of everyone on board. The 1912 ship did nevertheless carry 20 lifeboats, while modern humanity, for its journey across the vastly more dangerous seas of the ice ages, hasn't provided itself a single lifeboat, not one. While it cannot be determined whether an actual conspiracy stood behind the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, all the elements exist for a grand conspiracy to have stood behind the Titanic disaster, because the elements all do tightly mesh. Thus, it is extremely likely that the Titanic disaster has been planned and intentionally carried out. It is equally as likely that the disaster that humanity is presently rushing towards has been planned by the same oligarchy of empire and is presently being executed with the same type of intention, though for an infinitely more devastating outcome. with the entire world now being chained to the modern imperial Titanic, on a journey without lifeboats headlong into the Pleistocene Sea of the Ice Ages. It is extremely unlikely that anyone will survive on the present course. It is highly probable that the disastrous outcome is intended. It is in the nature of empire for this to be intended. The entire system of empire exists by conspiracies. It is a citadel built on conspiracies, since no natural universal principle supports empire as a legitimate element of civilization. Empire exists by conspiracies. Conspiracies are its heart and soul. Empire conspires to commit looting, slavery, and war, by which it exists. Conspiracies are its hallmarks, the hallmarks of great crime. Still, congratulations are in order for the masters of empire. Almost no resistance is offered in the modern world against the march of empire. Its march has destroyed many nations, and now threatens civilization and humanity as a whole, while the world stands silent, bowing in submission, patiently accepting its imposed fate. With its scientific and productive capability, humanity does have the power to direct its destiny, regardless of what the Ice Age brings with it. The power exists. It is real. We have the power for the first time in human history to stop an Ice Age. But will we choose to utilize this power and live? This is the critical question. Right now the answer is uncertain. Humanity is tightly chained to the system of empire by its own choice, by which it is doomed. Allow me to present a comparison that illustrates the modern effect of empire on humanity. It illustrates, to some degree, why the Titanic was doomed, and why modern society is doomed in the same manner and makes no effort to avoid this doom. For this illustration, allow me to compare modern society to passengers on an airliner. The airplane has us all on board. It lifts off. It is bound for distant destinations. Partway through the flight, flying at 48,000 feet, the captain clicks on the intercom and announces that he has been requested by his superiors at the Home Office to implement a new cost-saving process. He states that he has been instructed to turn the engines off. Instead of protesting, the people on board applaud. They really do this. This is the irony of our time. Society applauds whatever empire demands. It applauds its executioner. Oh yes, it does. It really does. Society has applauded for decades the long-standing campaigns of empire for radical deindustrialization and radical depopulation. No one has protested. The world applauds. The oligarchy is telling its passengers, riding the coattails of empire, that humanity has no need for industries and infrastructures, and for populations working in the industries, or for populations altogether. Civilization has peaked, they say. We don't have the power anymore to exist. And who needs those engines anyway, says the captain, when one can simply glide? The simple life is the path to real living. It is quality that counts. Being nicely isolated from one another, living by simple means in a primitive lifestyle, living close to the earth and so on. That's the real ideal future. Yes, people do applaud empire saying these things. That's being politically correct. There is a lot of this type of decapitation of reality going on in the sciences too, where society aims to fly without its engines powered. Unfortunately, by this dreaming, society collides with reality, especially when the sciences are committed to dreaming. An airplane without its engines powered doesn't fly, at least not for long. The primitive Earth by itself, without agriculture, science, technologies, and functioning economies, cannot support many people. Much less so can it during an ice age. And that is what we are already seeing on the horizon again, for which the transition has already started. In order to get into an ice age, with 7 billion people on the planet, vast infrastructures are needed, and they are needed fast. We must never forget, mankind came out of the last ice age with a world population of only a few million people, 10 million the most. That is what we are heading back into. On a ship without lifeboats, on an airplane without its engines powered, we have no hope unless we raise the platform that we are on to a higher level with the strength of our creative and productive human resources. The primitive and uncomplicated future that people are taught to seek today adds up to death by starvation. It is by a grand deception that society is being drawn into a catastrophe, entering unprepared into the Ice Age environment. That's the kind of future that very few will be able to survive. Isn't that what the primitive song means? When the captain sings obediently, "We can fly this airplane without engines. I'm going to turn the engines off. Engines produce pollution. We can fly this airplane better and more efficiently without those dirty polluting engines." The captain might be adding as a refrain, "Listen, people, how quiet the flight has become and how efficient." He might add, "Just imagine, my friends, we can make greater profits that way. Flying without engines is like gambling in the casinos of the financial markets, where one doesn't have to work, as one would in the physical economy, to make a living. We can all become rich by doing nothing. We can fly this airplane forever without engines. Listen how quiet the flight has become." This scenario is not absurd, because this is how empire operates, by enslaving other people whose life they own by the bonds of debt. In this bondage, society is doomed like an airplane with its engines turned off. Of course, with its engines turned off, the airplane will crash long before it gets to its destination. The process of turning society's engines off produces a systemic crisis. There is something wrong in the system when society tries to fly its civilization without its engines powered. The core issue, therefore, needs to be corrected. or else the end result will be a systemic failure in civilization that ends with the extinction of humanity. Turning the engines off, especially in science, where this has already begun, is an act of decapitation. It is a crime against the future. Without our engines fully powered, we are not really human. The human society is capable of operating on a much higher level platform of power development, industrial development, and scientific development than we presently operate on. Powering an economy, creating resources for living, is the heart of civilization. This has nothing to do with natural biodiversity. Not a single grain of wheat is being consumed by humanity that has not been intentionally created. With our creative, productive intention, we have broken all the population barriers 1,000-fold. By raising the platform of science and technology further, the Ice Age won't pose a barrier either, which we otherwise would not survive. Our engine for this process is science and technology. It is a crime against the future for this vital platform to be decapitated. The opposite needs to happen. Its power needs to be increased. We simply cannot step away from science as our power engine, the principle-oriented platform that we have created, without losing our civilization and 9/10 of humanity with it that would have no physical means to exist without this platform. This is what we lose when we open up our economic foundation to become looted into impotence by the fascist forces of empire that have decapitated both economics and science. We have already lost far more under the umbrella of decapitated science and decapitated economics than we dare to imagine. Flying an airplane without engines is like society trying to face an ice age without new infrastructures for its food supply. The time for building those infrastructures, for starting those stalled engines anew, is just about now. The first step would have to be to get the captain to put the plane into a steep dive to relight its engines, unless there is enough battery power on board to do so electrically. When the relighting is accomplished and the engines are rolling again, a completely new world begins to unfold, a world of powered flight. Of course, this is no longer allowed in the modern world that empire owns, nor would anyone suggest so. The opposite happens with empire running the show. We always get back to that. Eventually, the captain who turns the engines off will come onto the intercom once more as the ground turbulence is beginning to be felt. He will speak in an assuring tone of voice to calm everyone, saying there is nothing to worry about, that the flight team has got everything under control and is making the necessary corrections. He will explain that the reason why the plane has lost so much altitude is simply that it carries too much dead weight, so that he is now going to jettison the engines and the unused fuel, the dead weight that weighs the plane down. Indeed, the moment the engines fall away, the plane lurches upward, but only for a moment. This has already happened in the real world. It happened back in the 1970s. This is when the policy of deindustrialization was put high on the agenda for America. The official goal was to achieve the controlled disintegration of the economy. The Fed's new chairman was hired for his commitment to this policy. At the same time, under the infamous National Security Memorandum 200 policy, the depopulation of the Third World nations was put on the agenda in order to prevent the economic development of these nations so that they wouldn't use their natural resources that the empire demands to be conserved for its future needs. And right in the middle of all that, in 1974, the global warming doctrine was invented to shut down energy utilization on which every economic process depends. On this platform of sailing without power, the great ship of humanity has been put on a collision course with reality. Its engines have been ejected. Its passengers' only hope is, at this point, that the captain may find an uncrowded highway to land on. Except this too won't happen, will it? With the engines gone, the aircraft's control systems lack the power to operate. The last thing that the passengers will likely see is the captain emerging from the cockpit, where nothing works anymore, asking the stewardess for a stiff drink. We may be closer to the critical point where the crash occurs than you may think. The USA has shed most of its productive industries, so that it now imports most of what it needs to live. But this is fast coming to an end, with the American dollar becoming increasingly worthless in the wake of America's $50 trillion bailout giveaway to the banks to pay for their gambling losses. Gambling, which is rigged to such an extent that it robs the nations blind, is called economics now, and is carried out on a grand scale. America is colliding with reality. The great ship called America, that has been proclaimed to be unsinkable, with fanfares blazing, is now sinking, and is sinking fast. Yes, the Titanic is sinking. It is going down ever more rapidly as its buoyancy, its productive and creative economic power, has been destroyed in its collision with the oligarchic system of mass thievery. However, the real Titan, which the empire aims to sink, is humanity itself, for which the sinking of America is just a prelude. To force a collision of the Titan with reality is now on the agenda. The intention has been stated loud and clear by the masters of empire for decades, already under the gentle name of depopulation. In real terms, however, depopulation means that the time for living for 90% of humanity is about to end. The project is on the table and is near its final stage. The coveted mass depopulation is in the process of being achieved with the already far advanced triple decapitation of civilization in the form of decapitated science, decapitated politics, and decapitated economics. The process of decapitation is synonymous with turning the engines off in civilization that has given humanity its remarkably liberating powered flight. All kinds of methods have been tried so far to sink the colossal Titan that humanity has become. The Titan, which humanity inherently is by its development potential, threatens the oligarchic dynasty in a big way. Science is critical for human development, It has liberated humanity from the earth and created the titan it has become. For this reason, science is now under attack to protect the oligarchic system. Historically, global looting and forced economic collapse, both assured by war, were the hallmark of the agenda of empire. But this proved to be not enough in the modern world. Humanity has been growing up. Thus the gloves are coming off. The gentle age is over. The decapitation process is increasingly put into the foreground. This more brutal stage became the stage of the world from the 1960s onward, a stage of deep cultural warfare, the takedown of science and education, the expanded doctrine of unlimited imperial wars. It gave us the global warming doctrine in the 1970s, AIDS in the 1980s, radioactive gas war and free trade looting in the 1990s, the takedown of nuclear power and the burning of food in automobiles in the 2000th decade, and all this together with the dawn of dictatorial global looting called bailouts. While the consequences are huge for everyone on these fronts, they are still deemed to be not radical enough in their killing humanity. For this reason, the decapitation of the support structures of civilization is being advanced to outright elimination. This happens in politics with increasing dictatorship, in the sciences with increasing elimination of reality, and in economics with hyperinflation, for which unlimited bank bailouts are orchestrated. How deadly this war against humanity is glaringly evident in the decapitation of science. Science is humanity's power engine. The decapitation of science to the point of the near elimination of it is a key component of the war of empire to sink the great titan that humanity is on the wings of science. While the front of decapitated science has many elements, one element stands out. Its code name is global warming. Global warming has become the doctrine that was invented in the late 1960s and early 1970s to counter the increasing concern in the scientific community about the consequences of the Earth reverting back to its normal glaciation state when the current interglacial holiday ends. The scientific community has become concerned with what needs to be done to avoid the consequences of the Earth becoming radically colder during the transition to the next ice age, such as to protect our food supply that depends on agriculture. While solutions are possible for protecting our agriculture, such as by relocating the entire northern agriculture into tropical regions, and if need be, to place it afloat on the equatorial sea, linked together by intercontinental bridges, the implementation of this type of option would create such an immensely powerful economic and cultural renaissance that the oligarchic imperial system would simply vanish. In order to prevent this option from being contemplated, the empire's hired writer H.G. Wells would suggest in our time that a global warming doctrine be invented as a front for decapitating the science that enables the strategic defense of humanity from taking off, that would doom empire forever. Wells has issued a strong warning to the oligarchy of his time about what would happen if scientific and technological progress would be allowed to flourish. In his novel, The Time Machine, Wells envisions a gentle people in a flourishing landscape where all their needs are met. A time traveler meets them, but he also meets in the background the dirty, industrious, scientific machine people who have created the noble creature's idyllic environment in which they keep the noble Eloi as their livestock for food. Wells' message to the oligarchy was then that if they don't keep science and industry under wraps, the machine people, the Morlocks, will eat them for breakfast. In this context, we see the start of the next ice age obscured, though it is fast approaching, with astrophysical science having been turned upside down and decapitated. The global warming doctrine was developed from this background as an element of decapitated science, as a project for hiding the truth. When science is turned upside down, society's critical power that it needs for powered flight is effectively turned off. Truth has been ejected thereby and been replaced with mythologies. On this path, the general discussion of the entire subject of the impending near transition to the next glaciation cycle, the next ice age, has been effectively banned. This is the same method that has been recently demanded also politically in the advancing decapitation of politics. The method is designed to spring the claptrap in the political arena. This happened in the Eurozone. A rule has been imposed in the Eurozone, or attempted, whereby parliamentary discussion in the Euro nations of the newly devised European Stability Mechanism can only be initiated by the head of a party and not by any common member of parliament. The gag rule is said to be needed because the proposed European Stability Mechanism is designed as a legal mechanism for looting all of Europe, which by its design is infinitely more deadly than the Federal Reserve trap in 1913 had been for America. Imposing a gag rule, as in this case for political decapitation, is common in all three major areas where decapitation is applied. It is as devastating in politics as it is in science and economics. In 1912, the gagging was applied by assassination. It was used to silence the opposition to the Federal Reserve trap. This early form of political decapitation was designed to enable the laws to be enacted that would give empire the power to loot the USA to its very core. And the project succeeded. It formed the first step towards turning the economic engines off in America. In 1974, the decapitation of science became another necessity for the masters of empire. The decapitation had already been started in the 1960s in the form of cultural warfare. It was expanded in 1974 with setting up the global warming doctrine in order to protect the empire's very existence from the potential Ice Age renaissance that was recognized at the time to be necessary for the defense of humanity against the coming Ice Age. Setting up the global warming claptrap was synonymous with traditioning truths from science altogether. Now, in 2012, on the economic front, The great crash of the monetarist system of empire is ripping deep through the economies of Europe. The collapse began in the USA in 2007, where it was plastered over with bailout funding. It ripped through Europe in 2010, where it inspired protests and violence. The entire monetarist system is now in tatters. It stands as but a gilded shell that is disintegrating, that no one can put together again, while the pieces are already falling off like so many stones from a crashing facade. The economic collision with reality could not be avoided. It is inherent in the monetarist system of empire that has decapitated the concept of economics with legalized looting that inevitably implodes civilization to the very point of its total collapse. The collapse of civilization is a failure that is built into the system of empire that has ejected from economics the principle of the general welfare for which an economic system exists. The European Union was an imposed design by the empire of oligarchy. It was not designed as a bridge to unite the nations for their general welfare and fulfilling the common aims of mankind. The Union was designed as a chain to bind the nations of Europe to a single ship by which they all could be sunk together. The process reflects the method pioneered with the sinking of the Titanic. How else would the masters of empire be able to destroy the economies of Europe that together constituted the largest economic bloc in the world at this time? The now proposed hyper-radical European Stability Mechanism is evidently designed to finish the job, to drive them all past the point of no return where the ship dies. The European Stability Mechanism cannot revive the Euro system built on looting economics. The system is dead because its economies have collapsed. A dead horse cannot be revived by dousing it with fresh blood sequestered from the living of the nations. The proposed European Stability Mechanism is a typical oligarchic cry before the crash. It is a cry for increased looting. If the mechanism became law, it would empower an unelected board of a financial elite to legally steal from the treasurers of all the Euro nations whatever funds they desired to bail out the bank's gambling losses. They would have the right, under the proposed Euro-wide law, to demand, within 7 days, unlimited funds from the European treasuries, which they would have the right to speculate within the financial markets in a manner that would please the banks, to bail them out, and this without supervision, without accountability, and without recourse by law. They would operate immune from investigation and from prosecution for whatever crimes they would commit. The mechanism is thereby designed as a permanent dictatorship over Europe without an end in sight and without even a discussion being allowed in the parliaments of Europe for this atrocity to become law. That's the phase of the new round of political decapitation. If the mechanism became law, its directorate of appointed officials would effectively operate in a law-free environment, a modern, untouchable mafia sitting on top of the European Union in a universal dictatorship that no state attorney would have the right to challenge, investigate their books, question their crimes, impose superstition, or even question the practices, much less to investigate whether the director is competent or not. Then those of the high mafia, who cannot be questioned, would have the right to demand enormous funds from any member country, to the point of such acts killing the populations with austerity, without allowing any opposition against the process from the affected members. This is today's scene of decapitated politics, a scene before the crash. This is synonymous with the captain leaving the cockpit, where nothing works anymore. The modern scene of deep political decapitation is also exemplary of the decapitation of science, as a means for forcing the Ice Age collapse of humanity that is being orchestrated just as effectively on the wings of science without truth. While the European dictatorship law may not be implemented, it illustrates how desperate the ruling oligarchy has become and how close society's collision with reality actually is. The scene also illustrates, to some degree, how close humanity's collision with the Ice Age reality potentially is. The world has jettisoned its engines. Science has jettisoned truth. On the wings of decapitated science now rides the global warming doctrine that blocks the recognition of reality. In this hyped-up circus of the global warming doctrine, humanity is heading towards a devastating collision with reality, because the real astrophysical Ice Age transition has already begun, with the strategic defense of humanity against it having been disabled. More and more precursors are coming to the foreground now that already touch the entire world with consequences that cannot be avoided, as the means for it have not been developed. In this regard, too, the captain has already left the cockpit where nothing works anymore. An appointed member of the crew now sits in his chair. While facing the passengers outside the cockpit, the captain asks the stewardess for a double martini to clear his mind of the nagging confusion that the evidence without science presents. While the artificial banning of the truth, replaced by mythological illusions, doesn't alter the astrophysical reality, it blinds society against the precursors that are already visible of the transition to the coming Ice Age, which the precursors indicate to be already in progress. A great tragedy is unfolding here, because the decapitation of science has effectively stopped humanity's response to the most critical challenge that lays ahead in its future. Humanity has placed itself on a collision course with reality and is perpetrating thereby a crime against the future. And this crime is enormous. On the course of decapitated science, nothing will be done to prepare the stage for the next glaciation cycle that threatens to disable all the northern agriculture simultaneously. But this is where most of the food for the world is grown. With decapitated science, the masters of empire have chained all of humanity onto a single ship to be sunk collectively. This again reflects the method that was pioneered with the Titanic. On this path of society coasting blindfolded towards its crash with the next ice age, humanity, the normally unthinkable titan, will collide with the astrophysical reality and sink. This is the evident intention behind the global warming scam. The intention is to cause humanity's collision with reality to happen, not to prevent it. Consequently, humanity playing along in this game, playing its role as a mouse, will then not survive. This great game is a part of the titanic struggle of empire against humanity. The oligarchy knows that its doom would be guaranteed in a normally developing world. The masters of empire are evidently aware of that. They also know that if the recognition of the coming ice age can be prevented until it is too late for humanity to respond to it, their coveted mass depopulation of the planet would result from it, and they fear they would survive. But would they? When agriculture fails all across the northern region and becomes marginal down to the latitudes of the tropics, the mass death of humanity cannot be avoided. No one can live without food. This means that the stakes are enormously high for the entire world in this modern, titanic warfare of empire against humanity. Humanity is inherently the great titan on this planet, but it is not unthinkable. When it plays the role of a mouse, with its power turned off, the coming ice age will sink it, for which the transition has already begun.